Aguas, who is a first-year graduate student in the MA English program with concentration in literature. She plans to pursue her doctoral degree with the hope of becoming a professor of creative writing as well as a novelist. And her paper is titled Defiled Purity and Deconstructed Morality, Analyzing the Corruption of Female Slaves in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl.
Thank you, Professor Crosby, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. Welcome. As the title suggests, this essay examines how Harriet Jacobs portrays the destructive impact of slavery on the sexual purity and morality of female slaves in her narrative. In this essay, I argue that the sexual abuse that female slaves suffered corrupted them in every aspect, not merely physically, but mentally and morally as well. Moreover, I assert that this corruption forced female slaves to formulate a new morality, one that differed from the moral perceptions of the white antebellum South. To outline the female slave's moral experience, I will first examine Jacobs' moral education during childhood. Secondly, I will analyze how sexual abuse gradually corrupted Jacobs' physical, mental, and moral state. Thirdly, I will show how Jacobs responded to this corruption by constructing her own morality based on faith in God and familial love. Furthermore, I argue that faith is instrumental in shaping a resilient moral construct that can thrive in the midst of slavery. Understanding the connection between abuse, morality, and the restorative power of faith will bring a new perspective to how we approach these topics as Christians and as literary scholars. To begin, I will offer a brief overview of the scholarly discourse on sexual purity and morality in the context of Jacobs' narrative. Sexual purity and morality have been subjects of significant interest to scholars examining female slave narratives. Scholars have discussed how the abuse female slaves were subjected to affected their sexuality, their ideas of family and womanhood, and how white slaveholders perceived female slaves in contrast to free white women. Though purity was exalted among free women, the highly sexualized environment of slavery made purity and morality an impossibility for female slaves. Additionally, the traditional religious system and virtue principles that sufficed for free white women proved inadequate for female slaves who suffered near constant sexual exploitation. Many scholars have recognized that these paradoxes necessitate the construction of a new morality for female slaves, but few have identified what this morality should be founded on. Some scholars, such as Melissa Daniels Rodriguez, assert that female slaves must base their morality on defiance and subversion of the cultural and political assumptions of their environment. Others, like Sarah Way Sherman, argue for a gentler morality that is flexible enough to adapt to the compromises that slavery requires. While these arguments both have merit in how they assess the female slave's experience, I contend that they omit a vital component in this new morality: faith. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs' genuine and persevering faith in God is the aspect that distinguishes her morality from the reductive virtues and hypocritical religiosity of the white antebellum South. Though it may require a greater sensitivity to a religious critique, I believe that faith is crucial in understanding the scholarly discussion of Jacobs' narrative. Additionally, addressing faith in Jacobs' narrative raises the greater question of whether slave narratives should be examined from that perspective of Christian criticism, and how this specific lens would benefit the scholarly discourse on this genre. Now that I have assessed the scholarship on female slave narratives, I will move to my analysis of Jacobs' narrative itself. Published in 1861, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is an autobiographical narrative that details her life as a slave and her journey toward freedom. Under the pseudonym of Linda Brent, Jacobs describes the terrors of growing up as a female slave and the abuses at the hands of her master, whom she calls Dr. Flint. Jacobs communicates how Dr. Flint's continual sexual harassment slowly dismantles the moral principles that she learned as a girl. As previously stated, Jacobs' initial moral education is the first point of my argument. Jacobs could not draw from the traditional religious teachings of the antebellum South to form her moral education. Robert Patterson describes the nature of established religion in the antebellum South in his article titled, "A Triple-Twined Reappropriation, Womanist Theology and Gendered Racial Protest," in the writings of Joretta Lee, Francis E. W. Harper, and Harriet Jacobs. Patterson observes that the prevailing message from the pulpits of white churches justified the abuses of slavery as consistent with biblical teachings. However, even if the religion of free whites in the South was not marred by these misconceptions, it was largely inaccessible to slaves. At various points in her narrative, for example, Jacobs describes events where the established church leaders and slaveholders hindered their slaves from pursuing religious instruction. Jacobs needed to turn to a different form of tradition for her initial moral education, a tradition of virtue and womanhood. Early in her narrative, Jacobs describes how her grandmother, as well as her first mistress, laid the foundation of her moral principles and what she believed about the purity of her womanhood. In Sarah Way Sherman's insightful analysis of Jacobs' narrative titled "Moral Experience in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl," she explains how Jacobs' grandmother and her mistress helped her build a moral framework that was predicated on the traditional ideas of feminine virtue outlined in the Cult of True Womanhood. These virtues include piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Of these virtues, purity was arguably elevated in traditional perceptions of virtue. Purity was the evidence of the piety that virtuous women maintained and the quality that enabled them to be submissive and honorable overseers of their domestic space. Martha Washington inspects the crucial role of sexual purity and the moral education of young women in her article titled "From Motives of Delicacy, Sexuality, and Morality in the Narratives of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Jacobs." She observes that purity was the pinnacle of morality, especially in the traditional moral construct of the antebellum South. However, the Cult of True Womanhood was fashioned as a moral aspiration for free women. It is insufficient to combat the depravity of slavery. Dr. Flint is able to systematically deconstruct Jacobs' original moral education by subjecting her to ongoing sexual harassment, which is the focus of my second point. In her narrative, Jacobs makes a striking statement. She says, quote, "Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women," unquote. Perhaps the most egregious way that females suffered under slavery was through sexual abuse. More than other slave narratives, even other female slave narratives, Jacobs' text shows the horror of sexual abuse and its pervasive consequences. Though he is never able to physically violate Jacobs, Flint's continual harassment still has detrimental effects on Jacobs mentally and morally. Dr. Flint begins dismantling Jacobs' moral perceptions by defiling her mental conception of sexual purity. By constantly speaking and writing to her about his sexual intentions, Flint corrupts Jacobs' mind and initiates the destruction of her innocence. Jacobs evidences this process saying, quote, "My master had done his utmost to pollute my mind with foul images and destroy the pure principles inculcated by my grandmother and the good mistress of my childhood," unquote. In addition, Flint's persistent harassment wreaks havoc on her emotional state by inspiring fear and destroying her hope of a morally acceptable union. Dr. Flint's threats also drive Jacobs to compromise her own sexual purity, an act which signals the complete deconstruction of her morality. Jacobs chooses to sleep with a free white man, identified as Mr. Sands, in an effort to deter Flint from violating her himself. Though they were born out of desperation, Jacobs states plainly that her actions were intentional. In her article titled "Civil Resistance and Procreative Agency in Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl," Rodriguez argues that Jacobs' choice to seek out Mr. Sands is a powerful act of agency. However, the deep moral anguish that Jacobs expresses in describing this event indicates the destructive impact it has. Jacobs' choice to sleep with Mr. Sand functions as the fatal blow to her sexual purity and the original standard of her morality. The reality of this brings sorrow, not triumph. Ann Taves evaluates Jacobs' response in her article titled Spiritual Purity and Sexual Shame, Religious Themes in the Writings of Harriet Jacobs. She comments, quote, Jacobs' inability to conform to the conventional canon of 19th century Protestant morality in the context of slavery was a continuing source of personal shame. Nevertheless, it is crucial to note that even if she had not gone to Mr. Sands, neither Jacobs' purity nor her morality could survive the condition of slavery. Sherman comments on this, explaining that Jacobs must find a way to reconcile her sexual purity and her status as a female slave, because the two cannot naturally coexist. Having detailed the sexual abuse that forced Jacobs to relinquish her purity and original moral conceptions, I come to the third point of my argument, where I will examine how Jacobs adopted a new morality that could persevere and thrive even within slavery. Jacobs' morality is new insofar as it is not rooted in the religious sensibilities and traditional virtues of the white antebellum South. Nevertheless, it is vital to note that in forsaking these ideals, Jacobs does not abandon purity altogether. When the horrors of slavery tried to physically and mentally condition Jacobs to corruption, she persevered in her pursuit of purity. Jacobs models her purity after the true purity described in Scripture. The Bible clearly commands sexual purity. Galatians 5:19-21, for instance, instructs people to avoid sexual immorality and anything that defiles their bodies. However, as much as the Bible speaks about the purity of the body, it also demands the purity of the heart. James 1:27 states, quote, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world, unquote. While Jacobs has lost hope for sexual purity, she demonstrates a purity of heart. She fulfills this in how she loves and cares for her children and her grandmother. And while she has been corrupted in certain ways, Jacobs has not allowed her faith in God to be marred by the evils of slavery. I will now explain how these two elements of Jacobs' purity form the foundation of her new morality. Jacobs' new morality is built on these two primary factors: faith in God and familial bonds of love. In surrendering her virginity, Jacobs acknowledges that God is the one who she has sinned against, so he is the only one who can restore her morality. Despite how slaveholders grossly misrepresented God to her and her family, Jacobs chooses to persevere in her faith, trusting and thanking him for the glimmers of grace that she has found in her otherwise darkening life. Jacobs' persistent faith in God is far more enduring and powerful than false religion or womanly piety. This becomes clear because Jacobs' faith does not falter when it is tested by years of danger and trial. Furthermore, she does not succumb to disillusionment. During her time of confinement in the attic of her grandmother's shed, Jacobs admits that she wrestles with her faith. Describing the difficult dilemma of unmerited suffering and the mercy of God, Jacobs says, quote, these things took the shape of mystery, which to this day is not so clear to my soul, as I trust it will be hereafter, unquote. Even acknowledging her own confusion and doubt, Jacobs gives thanks to God later in the same chapter for preserving her and her loved ones. No longer founded in the ideas of female chastity and domesticity, Jacobs' new morality is instead founded upon her familial bonds of love, evidenced in the connection to her grandmother and through her journey of motherhood. Jacobs' bond with her grandmother is one of the strongest in the narrative. Throughout her life, Jacobs' grandmother modeled faithfulness and sacrificial love for her. When Jacobs loses her parents, her grandmother raises her and establishes her faith in God. When Jacobs is forced to go into hiding, her grandmother encourages her and helps her raise her own children. Jacobs' grandmother is her rock, an enduring source of strength and a paragon of morality. Jacobs' morality is also fundamentally strengthened by her bond with her children. It is through the vocation of being a mother that Jacobs is able to fully redeem her virtue and assume the place that her grandmother once held for her as a moral instructor to her children. Sherman evaluates the vital function of Jacobs' identity as a mother. She says, quote, the central experience of her mature morality is neither virginity nor its loss, but motherhood, unquote. Jacobs demonstrates the veracity of her new morality through the sacrificial love she shows her children. Instead of pursuing her own freedom, Jacobs remained imprisoned in an attic for 7 years, in part so that she can be close to her children. Even in the midst of these circumstances, Jacobs done all that she was able to care for them. She even risked being discovered by her older abuser in an attempt to secure her children's freedom. Jacobs' morality is further solidified by the fact that she is able to serve as a moral instructor for her daughter, who she called Ellen in the narrative. Jacobs tells Ellen to strive for goodness, pray continually, and trust God in all things. Knowing that her daughter will likely face the same challenges that she did, Jacobs does not instruct her daughter in the cult of true womanhood. Rather, she teaches Ellen her new morality predicated on faith and love. Though Jacobs and her children are still in the grip of slavery until almost the final moments of her narrative, the new morality they practice survives and continues to strengthen and unite them, even in this state of bondage. As I have shown in my analysis, the female slave experience is characterized by sexual exploitation that leads to corruption. Though abuse deconstructs Jacobs' morality and purity initially, she finds redemption through adopting a new morality. Jacobs' new morality is rooted in her persevering faith and motivated by the love that she has for her family. Through pursuing these things, Jacob reconstructs her moral standard and finds a hope that is incorruptible. Grasping the moral impact of sexual abuse is paramount because not only does it help us appreciate the full extent of the suffering that female slaves endured in the antebellum South, it also has the potential to enhance how we understand and represent sexual abuse in literature as a whole. Jacobs' narrative presents a complex and comprehensive picture of sexual abuse, one that considers every facet of how abuse traumatizes women. If we apply Jacobs' method to how we discuss sexual abuse and its resulting trauma, it will revolutionize the way that we understand literary criticism in this area. Moreover, if we implement Jacobs' conclusions concerning the connection between sexual abuse and morality, we can improve how we understand and address sexual abuse and its victims as Christians. Jacobs' narrative describes how the horror of sexual abuse can corrupt one's moral conceptions and potentially distort their perceptions of God. At the same time, her narrative demonstrates how undaunted faith and love can help mend those who have endured severe traumas and restore their hope. Recognizing this, Christians can approach those who have suffered from sexual abuse with greater sensitivity. More importantly, Christians can help abuse victims find healing and peace through experiencing the pure and unconditional love of Jesus Christ. Thank you.